In September 476 AD, the administrative thread of the Western Roman Empire was cut. The ancient world's primary organizing structure collapsed. Our timeline follows the break, but we can trace a different path, a reality where the thread holds and the empire finds a way to continue. The historical reality of the 5th century was a landscape of decay. When the central government failed, the courts, taxation systems, and trade networks that sustained Europe for 500 years simply ceased to function. The resulting power vacuum left the continent fragmented, illiterate, and unable to maintain the roads that once connected it. The divergence begins with a decision on the Via Postumia in 475 AD. General Marcus Flavius Aetius the Younger receives orders to march his veterans east to support a political puppet. He chooses to trust his own judgment instead. Aetius turns his column west, beginning a 15-year program of practical, unglamorous stabilization to keep the empire breathing. Aetius targeted the massive, untaxed estates of the aristocracy, the latifundia. His 479 AD land reform forced these owners to either pay assessed taxes or provide trained men for the legions. This created a new class of military smallholders whose tenure was tied to service, ensuring the land fed the army and the army protected the land. This shift moved Western civilization away from the pattern of catastrophic collapse and painful recovery. In this timeline, the empire's defining characteristic is heavy, unbroken institutional continuity. In our history, the collapse of the state allowed the Christian Church to become the sole heir of Roman civilization. With no secular rival, the papacy eventually acquired the absolute authority to launch the Crusades, while classical learning was restricted to isolated monasteries. The surviving Roman state prevented this monopoly through the Concordat of Ravenna. By 501 AD, the empire subordinated the church hierarchy, gaining the right to audit monastic estates and influence the appointment of bishops. This partnership kept the church tethered to secular law, removing the institutional conditions that produced the religiously organized mass violence of the Crusades. Throughout the 6th century, the capital at Ravenna maintained its administrative reach. The Basilica of San Vitale stands as a product of this continuity, an era where the state continued to collect taxes, to staff courts, and employ literate clerks, while the rest of Europe in our timeline was descending into fragmentation. When the Islamic expansion began in the 7th century, Arab scholars and merchants encountered a functioning Roman state rather than a power vacuum. The Mediterranean remained a circulatory system of active trade and administrative communication. This environment fostered a bilateral intellectual exchange across the sea. Latin scholars in Milan argued with Arab scholars in Carthage in real time, a process of systematic debate called disputatio or jadal. Classical and Islamic philosophy evolved together through these merchant networks, rather than being lost and rediscovered centuries later. Because the Roman universities had established natural philosophy as a domain separate from theology back in the 10th century, new scientific models faced academic debate rather than violent suppression. By 1538, Sophia Oriana of Carthage published a mathematical demonstration of the heliocentric universe that was taught in every imperial university within a century. When institutions remain stable, the collision of cultures is transformed. Instead of holy wars, the Mediterranean produced an engine for shared scientific advancement. In 1347, the Black Death reached the Mediterranean. In our timeline, the plague killed nearly half of Europe's population, shattering the feudal labor system and damaging the credibility of a church that could neither explain nor stop the dying. The alternate Roman timeline met the plague with an existing public health infrastructure. The imperial administration mobilized quarantine protocols, isolation measures, and debt relief programs developed through centuries of urban management. Millions still perished, but the mortality rate was held to 30%. This difference saved tens of millions of lives and allowed the imperial bureaucracy to absorb the economic shock, preventing the total institutional collapse that defined our late Middle Ages. A continuous state has no defense against a bacterium, but its deep institutional memory can prevent a biological tragedy from triggering a civilizational ruin. The 20th century in our timeline was a product of the nation-state model, a system of competing powers with no mechanism for resolving conflict short of mechanized warfare. This industrialized slaughter reached its peak in the First World War. By mid-century, those conflicts had left the physical infrastructure of European civilization in ashes. The drive for racial homogeneity within those nation-states led to the Holocaust, the bureaucratic application of industrial logistics to the project of human extermination. These specific catastrophes never develop in a surviving Roman world. Because the Western Empire remains a multi-ethnic, legally unified entity, the concept of the German or Italian nation-state never takes root. Conflicts are absorbed by a 2,000-year-old legal framework designed to negotiate disputes between diverse groups. Furthermore, the Jewish communities maintain their continuous legal standing under the Jus Gentium. The same laws apply to all non-Roman peoples for 2 millennia, providing an institutional depth that prevents the isolation required for industrialized genocide. This absence of modern horror comes at a price. A civilization this old is paralyzed by its own traditions. Progress is agonizingly slow because the systemic cost of changing a 2,000-year-old bureaucracy is always higher than the cost of maintaining it. Modern Rome functions as a seamless integration of its entire history. People cross the Tiber on bridges maintained since the 4th century, while the daily imperial press reports on the Senate's 30-year debate over colonial reparations for the American territories. This is the difference between a ruin and a home. Our history treats the Pantheon as an artifact recovered from the past. In the alternate timeline, it was simply maintained, a space whose floor has been walked on every day for 1,900 years. This world still grapples with exploitation, deep inequality, and political gridlock. It remains a society where the legal system is often used by the powerful to protect their interests at the expense of the weak. The final takeaway isn't that this timeline is better. It's that civilization is not a final destination, but an endless argument over what we owe each other. When that argument is protected by stable institutions rather than broken by violence, it creates the possibility of a world that can inhabit its past while still negotiating its future.